A capabilities approach to cultural policy. This talk focuses on the work of the Traction Research Project, which is looking at opera co-creation and digital technology as a means of social inclusion. It's divided into 4 parts. First of all, a discussion of the human right of cultural participation. Secondly, how that right is translated into policy and the limitations of current approaches. Thirdly, how the Traction Project is researching alternatives. And finally, the relationship between Traction, the 2020 Rome Charter, and the idea of cultural capabilities. Culture was established as a human right in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where everyone is guaranteed the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. It's that idea of participating in the cultural life of the community that I've always considered to be important. For many people, it may seem odd to make cultural participation a human right, but as this famous painting by Edouard Manet of Olympia illustrates, the representation of people in our cultural life is both revealing and significant in terms of how our rights are accessed. Our social position is affected by our ability to be represented or to represent ourselves in cultural life. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was followed by an international covenant on economic, social and cultural rights, which tried to put the more declarative aspects of the original document into policy format. And here we see that the steps change so that states parties of the government are encouraged to undertake conservation, development and diffusion of science and culture. This is a significant change in language and conception. It's a shift from the person to the state. The Declaration is concerned with a person's right to participate in the cultural life of the community. The Covenant is concerned with state actions in the provision of culture. The Covenant loses sight of the diversity and the complexity of cultural participation and its importance to a person's human rights, agency and dignity. At best, the Covenant can be interpreted to support the democratisation of culture, versions of which have been the basis of cultural policy in Europe since the 1950s. But it could also be interpreted as requiring no more than a laissez-faire attitude to culture by states, who can limit policy to encouraging private and civil society actors. Since the 1950s, European states have pursued a policy of cultural democratisation as an expression of the welfare state. It has consisted principally in financing cultural production of institutions and artists and promoting access to cultural services. After important early successes in the 1950s and 1960s, the policy has stalled and made much less progress in recent decades. What's the problem? Well, partly it's down to its own success. The policy of cultural democratisation has changed the needs and demands of an increasingly educated, prosperous and leisured population. Culture's languages, forms and expressions have expanded and fragmented dominant cultural authorities. And in the neoliberalised, globalised economy, new methods of cultural creation and distribution are transforming cultural participation. Today, one result is that in Europe there is a large publicly supported cultural sector that is confused about its mission and how to achieve it, fearful of losing its existing audience, and at worst, risking irrelevancy. This is not a new problem. Since the 1970s, policymakers, artists and campaigners have sought alternatives to the idea of the democratisation of culture that could protect and advance people's right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community. The most important idea was cultural democracy, first advocated by the Council of Europe in 1974 in an effort to recognise cultural diversity and pluralism. But the complexity and vagueness of the idea of cultural democracy has prevented it gaining ground over the much simpler idea of extending access to culture. It's into this territory that the Traction Project enters. Opera is a symbolic peak of European culture, but also where the crisis in cultural democratisation is most evident. Traction uses innovative digital technology to facilitate opera co-creation between professional and non-professional artists. It tests a person-centric approach that offers an alternative basis for socially inclusive cultural policy. At the heart of the Traction Project are 3 community opera trials, one in Barcelona, one in Ireland, and one in Portugal. They offer a very different range of projects. In Spain, the partner is the Grand Theatre of the Liceu, an opera house that is 175 years old. The project involves working with local people, the neighbours of the opera house in the Raval neighbourhood, and producing a full-scale community opera production in the main auditorium of the opera house. And it is using 2 of Traction's technologies, co-creation space and co-creation stage. In Ireland, Irish National Opera is better seen as an opera producer with no venue of its own. There, the project involves Irish speakers living in remote areas, teenagers in rural communities, and adults in the periphery of the Dublin conurbation. And for the first time, as far as we're aware, the project is attempting to make a community opera in virtual reality. And finally, the third project is led by a music school, Sociedade Artística Musical dos Poços, in the village of Poços on the edge of a town called Leiria between Lisbon and Porto. It involves young prisoners, family members, former inmates, guards and members of the Justice Ministry. It is specifically aimed at supporting people's reintegration into society after their release from detention. And it is using the co-creation space and particularly the co-creation stage technology, which I'll talk about in a moment. The Portuguese project is the one that I will talk about most in this presentation. The project is led by SAMP and it involves young inmates, including the group that you can see here, working in the prison in a specially adapted space within the prison. The project builds on previous Mozart opera productions created by inmates with SAMP in 2015 and 2017, but involves many more people this time outside the prison. Most importantly, it's a new opera, co-created by inmates with professional artists, including composers, musicians and a librettist, and rooted in the experience of the young men and their families. The project uses co-creation space, a digital technology developed by traction partner Vicomtech, to enable people in different locations to perform together simultaneously. It is this technology that allows the project to include people inside and outside the prison in the co-creation of a new opera. A work in progress of this production has just been performed on the 2nd and 3rd of June 2021, simultaneously from a concert hall in Lisbon and the youth prison in Leiria. The SAMP project does not extend access to opera in a logic of cultural democratisation. It supports people to create their own opera from their own experience, values and meaning making with others. In the cultural policy dichotomy of the 1970s, SAMP aims for cultural democracy, not cultural democratisation. How is this about human rights? Traction is concerned with how people can exercise their right to participate in the cultural life of the community. Nos voces toda a gente shows that even people who are legally excluded can exercise that right, and that society benefits as a result, as it always does from social inclusion. It is person-centric because Traction is using a capabilities approach inspired by the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum to understand the social impact of participating in the community opera trials. Its focus is not on how cultural policy can affect the supply of and access to cultural goods and services, the democratisation model, but on people's capabilities for participation in cultural life, both within the logic of incarceration, but also as a preparation for life after incarceration. In doing that, it is making a direct connection with the 2020 Rome Charter. Another member of the Traction Partnership, François Matarasso, was also the lead writer of the 2020 Rome Charter, published in May last year by the City of Rome and United Cities and Local Government, a global association that supports local government, including cultural activity. The Charter defines 5 cultural capabilities on the grounds that if a person has access to these cultural capabilities, they can be said to participate in the cultural life of the community. The cultural capabilities are those of being able to discover, to create, to share, to enjoy, and to protect culture. To discover in the sense of finding out about oneself and learning about others through culture. To create in order to express yourself through artistic creativity. To share that work, to show what is meaningful to you, what your cultural values are, and hence to participate in the cultural life of the community you live in. To enjoy by appreciating, distinguishing, and making your own cultural taste. And of course, to cherish and preserve what's been made in order that others can discover it. The capabilities set out in the Rome Charter are intentionally simple, since democracy, including democracy, cultural democracy, depends on people knowing their rights and understanding them. These capabilities are person-centric because they give people choices and therefore freedoms about if, how, when and why to participate in the cultural life of the community. They see culture as a meaning-making system and the ability to participate in it as being one of the fundamental guarantors of how people can protect their human dignity and their human rights. This work is just a beginning. The Traction Project is 18 months into a 3-year programme, and a lot of the work done so far has been undertaken in the context of the pandemic. It has been preparatory both in terms of developing technologies, developing ideas, and developing the 3 community opera projects that will be presented next year. Traction's thinking about opera co-creation, the right to participate in the cultural life of the community, and cultural capabilities as a foundation of human rights is, like the SAMP Community Opera, work in progress. But we hope and believe it shows a path towards an alternative form of cultural policy that, in being human-centric, is better able to reflect the diversity, complexity, and value of culture today. Thanks for your attention. There's more information about the project and the project website at www.traction-project.eu.